The sledgehammer swung with a rhythmic, wet thud, and every time it connected, a piece of my sanity, and about $40 worth of ceramic, exploded into the night air. I watched the screen of my tablet, the night vision feed turning the scene into a ghostly, neon green horror movie. There she was, Monica, the president of the Oak Crest Homeowners Association. A woman who lived for muted sandstone pallets and 2 p.m. lawn height inspections was currently standing in the middle of my yard at 3 a.m., screaming at a garden gnome. Visual harmony, she grunted, bringing the hammer down on a porcelain squirrel. Crunch. Architectural integrity. Shatter. She moved to the next row of my unauthorized statuary, her breath coming in ragged white plumes in the cold air. She looked less like a community leader and more like a high priestess of beige gone feral. She had no idea that 40,000 lumens of stadium lighting were rigged to a silent trigger under my thumb, or that the local police were already 3 blocks away, rolling silent and dark toward my property line. She also didn't seem to notice the general, a tiny, 3-inch ceramic turtle sitting on a velvet cushion atop a milk crate throne, staring back at her with unblinking, painted eyes. That turtle was the reason she'd finally snapped. That turtle was the reason my front door was currently a shade of neon purple so bright it could be seen from space. For 3 weeks, I had been the ghost in her machine. I had turned my property, the one plot of land her precious HOA handbook couldn't touch, into a funhouse mirror of every petty fine and ridiculous rule she'd used to bully my best friend Steve. Every time she fined him for a red birdhouse, I built a redder one. Every time she measured his grass, I let mine grow into a meadow. I was the loophole she couldn't close. And as I watched her raise that sledgehammer for one final, devastating blow against the general, I knew I had finally won. But to understand why a grown man would go to war over a ceramic reptile, you have to understand the line. The 6-inch gap between my dirt and hers where the rules of the world simply stopped. Today's story is from Mark Kirk, a man whose sense of loyalty is as unyielding as the property line he calls a battlefront. Mark isn't a natural provocateur, but he is a firm believer that common sense should always trump a clipboard, especially when his best friend is being bullied. By turning his farmhouse lawn into a neon purple sanctuary for non-compliant outcasts, he proves that the only thing more powerful than a restrictive rule is a neighbor with a little bit of land and a whole lot of spite. Before we dive in, if you like stories like this, smash that like button now. Comment below on where you're listening from and what you would have done if you were in Mark's situation. If you were Mark, would you have gone after the HOA even though technically they did nothing to you? Or would you have minded your own business safe in the knowledge that Monica had not power over you whatsoever? Was Mark justified in getting involved in something that might be egged was none of his business? Leave your thoughts below. But now, let's hear Mark's story as told in his own words. Steve and I didn't become friends over shared hobbies, professional networking, or a mutual love for suburban living. We became friends 15 years ago because his radiator had a catastrophic, steam-filled meltdown on my gravel driveway. He had just bought the very first house in the development, a shiny box of suburban promise that smelled of fresh carpet and unfulfilled dreams. I had spent that entire afternoon helping him move a heavy oak dresser that refused to navigate his standardized front door. By the time we finished a 6-pack of cheap lager and successfully wedged the furniture into his bedroom, we were brothers. In the 15 years that followed, we became the anchors of each other's lives. I was the one who held the ladder when he nervously painted his first nursery. I was the one who sat in the hospital waiting room, pacing the linoleum for 6 hours, until the doctor told us Leo had been born healthy. And Steve? Steve was the guy who showed up with a chainsaw at 6 a.m. after the great storm of 19 to help me clear the massive oak limb that had crushed my front porch. We knew each other's secrets, shared each other's tools, and lived on either side of that invisible line in a state of perfect, unbothered harmony. But tonight, the harmony had been replaced by a suffocating tension. The air was thick with the scent of grilled ribby, usually the hallmark of a celebratory Friday night, but the mood was anything but festive. As I sat on my porch, looking across the narrow gap at Steve, I saw a man who looked like he'd been hollowed out. He wasn't eating. He wasn't even drinking his beer. He was just staring at a small, slightly crooked red birdhouse perched on his fence. It was a simple thing, built from scrap cedar and painted a vibrant, primary red by his 7-year-old son, Leo. It was a messy, proud little project, complete with a lopsided roof and a tiny L carved into the bottom in a child's shaky hand. $250, Mark, Steve said, his voice flat and hollow, barely rising above the sound of the crickets. He reached into his pocket and tossed a neon orange slip of paper onto the table between our lawn chairs. Monica hand-delivered it while Leah was inside watching cartoons. She didn't even knock to talk to me like a human being. She just taped it to the birdhouse post and walked away like she was tagging a crime scene for the evening news. I picked up the paper, the neon color practically vibrating in the twilight. The header read, Crest Estates, official notice of non-compliance. She says the color is a chromatic violation, Steve whispered, his eyes fixed on the dirt beneath his feet. Apparently, primary red clashes with the approved autumnal palette of the neighborhood. And the structure itself? She's calling it an unauthorized secondary dwelling. It's a birdhouse, Mark, a kid's craft project, a place for a couple of sparrows to sleep. But to her, it's a direct assault on the architectural integrity of the street. I felt a slow, steady heat rise in my chest that had nothing to do with the embers in the grill. I looked at the surveyor's stake, the little iron pipe buried in the dirt, almost hidden by my unmanicured grass, which marked where the HOA's power ended and my freedom began. I looked at the birdhouse, then at the orange slip, and finally at Steve, whose hands were shaking with a mixture of fury and absolute defeat. She gave me 24 hours to remove it, Steve continued, his voice cracking. Or the fine doubles every day it remains in place. I told Leo we might have to take it down tonight, and he looked at me like I'd betrayed him. He asked if the birds did something wrong to get in trouble. How do you explain an HOA president to a 7-year-old who just wanted to build something with his dad? I didn't answer immediately. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the porch boards, and walked into my garage without a word. I grabbed my cordless driver, a handful of 3-inch deck screws, and a spare 4x4 pressure-treated post from my scrap pile. I marched back out to the fence, my boots thudding on the turf. Mark, what are you doing? It's dark, Steve said, standing up and shielding his eyes from my porch light. She wants it gone from your property, right? I asked, squinting as I lined up the driver bit with the mounting screws on his fence. Yeah, obviously. She said it has to be removed from the premises by dawn. And your premises, your legally defined property, ends exactly here, I said, pointing my toe at the iron stake. With a quick, mechanical zip-zip, I unscrewed the mounting brackets from Steve's fence. I lifted the birdhouse, heavy with the weight of Leo's pride, and stepped exactly 6 inches to the left, crossing over to my own grass. I took my sledgehammer, drove the new post deep into my soil with several heavy, satisfying thuds, and mounted the birdhouse right on top of it. It's off your property, Steve. It's on mine. And last time I checked, Monica doesn't own a square inch of my dirt. She doesn't get a vote on my paint colors, and she can't find me for a single thing I do. Tell her the birdhouse moved to a better neighborhood with better neighbors. Steve looked at the birdhouse, then at me, and for the first time in weeks, he actually laughed. A real, belly-deep sound that signaled the start of a very long, very petty, and very public war. The sun hadn't even cleared the tree line the next morning when the sound of a slamming car door echoed through the cul-de-sac. I was already on my porch, wrapped in a fleece jacket and cradling a thermos of coffee that was mostly steam. I knew she was coming. In a neighborhood as curated as Crest Estates, a primary red birdhouse on a 6-foot post was the visual equivalent of a flare gun going off in a library. Monica's silver SUV didn't just pull up. It performed a tactical halt exactly at the edge of Steve's driveway. She didn't get out at first. I watched her through the steam of my coffee, her silhouette rigid behind the windshield. I could almost feel the heat of her blood pressure rising. When the door finally swung open, she stepped out with her leather-bound clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. She was dressed in a beige tracksuit that perfectly matched the muted sandstone of the curb, a walking, talking embodiment of the HOA handbook. She marched toward Steve's front door, her heels clicking a sharp, angry rhythm on the pavement. She didn't look at me, but I knew she could see me out of the corner of her eye. She stopped in front of the empty spot on Steve's fence where the birdhouse had been. For a second, a smug, satisfied smirk touched her lips. She thought she'd won. She thought she'd broken him. Then, she turned her head 6 inches to the left. The smirk vanished so fast it looked painful. Her eyes locked onto the red birdhouse, now sitting proudly on my side of the line, vibrating with color against the morning mist. She froze. I took a slow, deliberate sip of coffee and gave her a small, polite nod. "Morning, Monica," I called out. "Beautiful day for a walk, isn't it?" She didn't respond to the greeting. She pivoted on her heel, her face a shade of crimson that nearly matched the birdhouse. She stomped over to the property stake, peering down at the iron pipe in the dirt as if she could move it with the sheer force of her will. She pulled a retractable measuring tape from her pocket, because of course she carried one, and measured the distance from the stake to my post. "This is a provocation, Mark," she hissed, her voice low and trembling. "You're interfering with a closed enforcement action. This structure is non-compliant. It's an eyesore. It's it's aggressive." "It's on my land, Monica," I said, leaning back in my chair. "And as you've reminded me several times over the years when my grass gets a bit long, I'm not a member of your little club. My land, my rules. And I happen to think red is a very festive color for a bird's home." She looked like she wanted to scream, but Monica was a creature of rules, and she knew she had no standing on my grass. She turned her fury back toward Steve's house just as he stepped out onto his porch, looking exhausted. "Steven?" she barked. "You think you're clever? You think moving a violation 6 inches to the left clears you? This is deliberate mockery of the association's standards." Steve looked at me, then back at her. "It's not on my property, Monica. I followed your order. It's removed from my premises. I can't control what my neighbor does on his own time." Monica's jaw tightened. She looked back and forth between us, her brain clearly scrambling to find a loophole. She looked at the birdhouse, then her eyes drifted down the length of Steve's driveway, searching for blood. They landed on his mailbox. It was a beautiful mailbox, honestly. Steve had built it out of reclaimed barnwood a few years back, with a heavy iron latch and a hand-carved flag. It was sturdy, rustic, and had character. Three things Monica hated. "I've been reviewing the 2026 aesthetic guidelines," Monica said, her voice regaining its icy composure as she scribbled furiously on her clipboard. "Article 4, Section 9. All mail receptacles must be of a uniform, black, powder-coated metal finish with a standard arched top. Your mailbox, Stephen, is excessively rustic and lacks visual harmony with the streetscape. That's a $100 initial fine, recurring daily until it is replaced by a compliant model." She tore the orange slip off her pad and slapped it onto Steve's wooden mailbox with the force of a judge's gavel. Without another word, she marched back to her SUV, floored the engine, and peeled away. Steve walked down his driveway, staring at the new orange sticker. He looked like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. $100 a day, Mark. I can't afford a war of attrition. I'll have to go to the hardware store and buy one of those plastic black boxes." I stood up and walked down to the edge of my driveway. I looked at my own mailbox, a boring, HOA-approved, black metal box with a standard arch top that the previous owner had installed. "Don't go to the store yet," I said, reaching for my socket wrench. "I've got a better idea. If she wants visual harmony, let's give her exactly what she asked for." Steve watched, confused, as I began unscrewing my boring black mailbox from its post. "What are you doing?" "We're swapping," I said. "I'll take your rustic one. You take my compliant one. I've always liked your woodwork anyway, and since I'm not in the HOA, I can have a mailbox made of gold-plated Lego bricks if I want to." 10 minutes later, the swap was complete. Steve's driveway now featured a perfectly boring black metal box that met every single one of Monica's precious guidelines. Meanwhile, my driveway boasted a beautiful, handcrafted wooden mailbox that looked like it belonged on a mountain retreat. I patted the reclaimed wood and looked at Steve. "There, he's compliant. I'm, I'm just being me. Let's see what she tries to fine you for next." Steve started to smile, but then he looked down the street toward Monica's house. "You know she's just going to keep going, right? She's not going to stop until I'm living in a beige box with no windows." "Let her try," I said, looking at the red birdhouse and the rustic mailbox. "The more she fights, the more of your stuff I get to keep." The beige war officially began on a Tuesday. It was a day of oppressive humidity and even more oppressive bureaucracy. I was in my garage sharpening the blades on my lawnmower when I saw the aesthetic task force van pull into the cul-de-sac. It wasn't just Monica this time. She had recruited a local architectural consultant named Julian, a man whose scarf was far too long for the weather and whose nose seemed permanently turned up at the scent of anything built before 2010. They spent nearly 40 minutes on the sidewalk in front of Steve's house. Julian held up various color swatches against the afternoon sun, squinting through a specialized viewfinder. Monica stood behind him, arms crossed, nodding like a general approving a bombing run. They didn't even look at me, even though I was standing in my driveway with a cold soda, watching the performance. After much deliberating, Monica marched up Steve's walkway and taped a new orange slip, larger than the previous ones, directly onto his front door. Steve called me 10 minutes after they left. He sounded like a man who was about to have a nervous breakdown. "It's the door, Mark. She's claiming my front door is champagne toast, which was the approved color in 2022. But the updated 2026 handbook requires muted sandstone. It's a $50 a day recurring fine until I provide proof of professional repainting." "Muted sandstone?" I asked, looking at his door. "It's a light tan, Steve. It's the same color as the dirt." "Precisely," Steve groaned. "She says my door is too energetic for the street's visual flow." I looked up the paint. It's $200 a gallon, and the only authorized contractor is her brother-in-law. I looked at my own front door. It was a perfectly respectable, completely invisible shade of off-white. It was boring. It was safe. It was a blank canvas. "Don't paint your door, Steve," I said, a slow, predatory grin forming. "In fact, don't do anything. I'm going to the hardware store." "Mark, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if Monica wants to talk about chromatic energy, I should give her a physics lesson." I spent $60 at the paint counter. I told the clerk I wanted the most aggressive, eye-searing neon purple they had in the system. When he showed me a swatch called electric ultraviolet, I told him to add 2 extra shots of pigment. It was the kind of purple that looked like it was vibrating. It was the color of a disco ball's fever dream. I spent the rest of the evening applying 3 thick coats to my front door. I didn't stop there. I painted the trim. I painted the threshold. I even painted the brass knocker. By the time I was finished, my house looked like it had been punched in the face by a giant grape. The door didn't just stand out. It felt like it was screaming at the rest of the neighborhood. As the sun went down, I turned on my porch light. The neon purple glowed with an otherworldly intensity, casting a long, violet shadow that stretched across the property line and landed right on Steve's non-compliant door. Steve walked out onto his porch and stared. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just leaned against his doorframe, looked at my glowing purple portal, and started to chuckle. The chuckle turned into a laugh, and the laugh turned into a roar. "It's hideous, Mark," he shouted over the fence. "It's a crime against humanity." "It's art, Steve," I shouted back. "And according to the county assessor, this house is a sovereign entity. If Monica wants muted sandstone, she's going to have to look through a purple haze to see it." I sat on my porch in a rocking chair, right in front of my neon door, and waited for morning. I knew the task force would be back, and I wanted to be front and center when Monica's head finally exploded. I was still sitting on my porch the next morning, nursing a second cup of coffee that had gone cold, but I didn't care. I was too busy admiring the view. The neon purple door was even more offensive in the harsh, unforgiving light of a clear Tuesday dawn. It looked like a digital glitch in the Matrix, a jagged hole of electric ultraviolet ripped into the side of a perfectly boring century-old farmhouse. Passers-by on their morning jogs were doing double takes so violent, I actually worried about their cervical vertebrae. One man, a regular who usually kept his eyes glued to his fitness tracker, stopped dead in his tracks and stood there for a full 30 seconds, mouth agape, before moving on with a bewildered shake of his head. But it wasn't just the joggers. The very tension in the morning air had shifted. People weren't just looking at my door with horror. They were looking at it with a strange, quiet glimmer of something that looked suspiciously like hope. Around 9 a.m., Heather, the neighbor who lived on the other side of Steve, came shuffling down her driveway. She was still in her blue nursing scrubs, looking like she'd spent the last 12 hours battling a hospital's worth of emergencies and losing. She stopped at the edge of her manicured lawn, staring at my door for a full minute, as if her brain was struggling to process the sheer frequency of the purple light. Then, her eyes drifted over to the red birdhouse and the rustic mailbox. She walked toward the property line, moving with the cautious, deliberate steps of a soldier in a minefield, looking over her shoulder twice to make sure Monica's silver SUV wasn't prowling the street for a mid-morning inspection. It's bold, Mark," she whispered, her voice raspy from exhaustion. "I think I can see the afterimage of it burned into my retinas when I close my eyes. It's like looking directly into the sun if the sun were a disco ball." That's the intended effect, Heather, I said, leaning over the porch railing with a grin. I'm thinking of adding a neon green racing stripe down the center next week if the weather holds. How are things in the estates? Did the aesthetic task force approve your breakfast cereal? Heather's face fell, the brief moment of amusement replaced by a weary, deep-seated frustration. She reached into the pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a small, crumpled square of paper. It was that familiar, eye-searing neon orange. $60, she said, her voice trembling as she smoothed the paper against her thigh. I worked a double shift yesterday. We had a 3-car pileup in the ER, and I was running on caffeine and adrenaline for 14 hours. I didn't get home until 6:30 p.m. The HOA handbook, the one Monica keeps under her pillow, says all trash receptacles must be removed from the curb and secured within the garage by 6 p.m. sharp on pickup day. No exceptions, no excuses. I looked at the fine, then back at Heather. She was a woman who literally spent her life saving people. And here she was, being penalized for 30 minutes of visual clutter. She timed you? I asked, the heat rising in my chest. She must have been sitting in her car with a stopwatch, Heather corrected with a bitter, jagged laugh. I pulled into my driveway at 6:32 p.m., and she was already tucking this under my windshield wiper. When I tried to explain that I was literally in the middle of a life-saving surgery, she just looked at her clipboard and told me that consistency is the bedrock of community value. She actually said she hoped the patient had a nice, compliant garage to recover in. The absurdity of it felt like a physical weight in the air. Monica wasn't just enforcing rules, she was weaponizing them to strip away the humanity of everyone on the block. Is that right? I stood up, setting my thermos down on the railing with a definitive thwack. Well, Heather, I think it's time I showed Monica what real visual clutter looks like. If she wants to talk about the bedrock of community value, let's talk about the freedom of the farmhouse side. I walked to the side of my house, grabbed both of my heavy, industrial-sized plastic trash bins, and dragged them down the driveway. The wheels rumbled like thunder against the asphalt. I positioned them right at the very edge of my property line, 6 inches inside my boundary, and flipped the lids wide open so they gaped like hungry mouths. What are you doing? Heather asked, her eyes widening in a mixture of terror and delight. Today is Tuesday. Trash pickup isn't until next Monday. You can't just leave those there. Watch me, I said, wiping my hands on my jeans. See, since I'm not bound by the 6 p.m. rule, or any rule written in that beige book of hers, I've decided that my bins are going to live right here. All week. Every week. I might even start collecting extra cardboard from the local grocery store just to make the pile more consistent. If she wants a street that looks like a museum, she's going to have to deal with the loading dock on my side. I went back to my porch, sat back down in my rocking chair, and surveyed the tableau I had created. A neon purple door, a rustic wooden mailbox, a primary red birdhouse, and 2 gaping trash bins sitting like twin monoliths at the entrance to the neighborhood. No, I replied, looking down the street toward Monica's house. I'm going to give her exactly what she deserves, a neighborhood that refuses to be beige. Go get some sleep, Heather. I'll watch the bins. By noon, Monica's silver SUV appeared at the top of the hill. She slowed to a crawl as she approached, her brakes squealing in a long, high-pitched protest. She sat there for a long time, her window rolled down just an inch, staring at the open trash bins. I just leaned back, waved my coffee thermos at her, and gave her a thumbs up. She didn't wave back. She just revved her engine and sped away, the tires chirping on the pavement. But I knew the clipboard was already out. The war was officially entering a new, messier phase. The skirmish over the trash cans had sent a ripple of quiet electricity through the cul-de-sac, but it was a Friday evening gathering that turned my solo protest into a coordinated campaign of psychological warfare. Steve and Heather were sitting on my porch, safely buffered by the vibrating purple glow of my front door. Between us sat a cold pack of beer, a bowl of pretzels, and a brand new, heavy, leather-bound notebook I'd picked up from an office supply store that afternoon. I laid the book on the table with a heavy thud. I clicked a thick, black marker and wrote in bold, architectural letters on the first page, "The Spite Ledger." All right, I said, leaning into the violet light that made the beer bottles look like alien artifacts. If we're going to do this, we need to be scientific. I don't just want the big fines. I want every petty citation, every courtesy warning, and every whispered correction Monica has handed out in the last 48 hours. If she saw it and hated it, I want to know about it. Steve leaned forward, his face illuminated by the neon light. He looked more energized than I'd seen him in months. She hit Gary 3 houses down at 7:30 this morning. Gary was just trying to keep his hydrangeas alive in this heat. He left his hose out on the grass for 20 minutes while he went inside to answer the phone. Monica was on him like a hawk. $50 fine for improper storage of maintenance equipment and creating a trip hazard in a common visual field. I scribbled in the ledger. Entry 1, Gary, garden hose. Improper storage. Heather added her contribution, her voice regaining a sharp, defiant edge. She went after Mrs. Gable. You know Mrs. Gable. She's 84, and her garden is the only thing she has left. She has this tiny, 3-inch ceramic turtle tucked under a hosta leaf. You can't even see it unless you're standing in her flower bed. Monica called it unapproved statuary and told her it was a whimsical distraction that undermined the neighborhood's cohesive naturalism. She gave her 48 hours to rehome the turtle or face a daily penalty. I wrote, Entry 2, Mrs. Gable, ceramic turtle, whimsical distraction. The list went on for nearly 2 hours. It was a litany of the absolute absurd. A guy named Miller got a warning because his holiday wreath, a simple circle of dried grapevines, was left up 4 days past the seasonal transition deadline. A young couple at the end of the street was cited because their welcome mat featured a cartoon cat that Monica deemed not in keeping with the dignity of the estates. By the time we were finished, I had 4 pages of data and a deep sense of righteous fury. What's the master plan, Mark? Steve asked, eyeing the growing list. You're a legend for the door and the bins, but you can't exactly move Mrs. Gable's entire garden to your yard. I don't have to move their stuff, I said, looking out at my sprawling, unregulated lawn. I just have to mirror the sins she hates the most. Monica's power comes from her ability to make you feel like an outcast for being human. If a hose is an eyesore to her, I'm going to give her a plumbing nightmare. If a tiny turtle is a distraction, I'm going to give her a porcelain zoo. I'm going to become the physical embodiment of every rule she tries to enforce. The next morning, I went to work. I visited 3 different hardware stores and bought 500 feet of the brightest, most industrial-grade, high-visibility yellow garden hose they had in stock. I didn't coil it neatly. I didn't hide it behind a bush. I snaked it back and forth across my entire front walkway and over the porch railing in a giant, tangled yellow nest of rubber. It looked like a radioactive spaghetti spill that could be seen from low Earth orbit. Next, I hit every thrift shop and as-is garden center in a 20-mile radius. I returned with a truckload of the most magnificent junk I could find. I bought a stone gargoyle with a chipped nose, a plastic lawn deer with a missing ear, 3 concrete frogs, and a collection of wind-up sunflowers. I lined them up in a precise military formation along my property line, all of them staring directly across the street toward Monica's pristine, statue-free driveway. By Saturday afternoon, my house had become a living, breathing monument to everything the HOA handbook forbade. The spite ledger was no longer just a notebook. It was a blueprint for a revolution. I was just finishing the placement of a particularly hideous 2-foot-tall stone gnome that was holding a sign saying, "Welcome to the jungle," when Monica's silver SUV crawled to the curb. She didn't roll down the window this time. She just sat there, her silhouette frozen behind the tinted glass, staring at the yellow hose nest and the army of misbegotten statues. I stood up, wiped the garden soil from my palms onto my jeans, and slowly tapped the cover of the ledger. I didn't need to say a word. The ledger was open, the pen was ready, and as far as I was concerned, we were only on page 5. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon on Sunday evening when the next entry in the spite ledger presented itself. Steve had come over to help me adjust the positioning of a particularly cross-eyed concrete owl I'd placed near the property line. He looked over his shoulder toward Monica's house, his movements twitchy and nervous. "She's escalating, Mark," Steve whispered, the neon purple light from my door making his skin look bruised. "She hit the Miller family again. They have those little solar-powered pathway lights, the tiny ones that barely glow. Monica sent them a notice for light pollution and unauthorized nocturnal illumination. She says anything over a certain lumen count that hasn't been approved by the board is a nuisance to the collective peace." I looked at the Miller's house. Their lights were so dim you'd need a map and a flashlight just to find them. Monica wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. She was trying to dim the very world around her until everything was as gray and lifeless as her handbook. Light pollution? I asked, a slow, predatory warmth spreading through my chest. She wants to talk about lumens? I think it's time we enlightened her. I spent the next morning at a commercial electrical supply warehouse. I didn't want pathway lights. I wanted search and rescue lights. I purchased two industrial-grade motion-activated stadium floodlights, the kind used to illuminate construction sites and prison yards. Each unit was rated at 20,000 lumens. I spent the afternoon mounting them to the eaves of my garage. I calibrated the motion sensors with the precision of a watchmaker. I didn't want them triggered by a squirrel or a stray cat. I wanted them triggered by anything larger than 5 feet tall moving on the pavement of the cul-de-sac. "What are those?" Steve asked that evening, staring up at the massive white canisters bolted to my roof. "Those," I said, "are my security enhancements. I'm a single man living in a farmhouse, Steve. I have a lot of unapproved statuary to protect. I need to make sure I can see any nuisances that might be lurking in the dark." The first test occurred at 11:15 p.m. I was sitting in my darkened living room with a glass of bourbon, watching the feed from my doorbell camera. Monica's silver SUV rounded the corner, moving at a snail's pace. She was doing her nightly compliance patrol, her headlights dimmed as she scanned the neighborhood for rogue garden hoses or improperly parked cars. The moment her front bumper crossed the imaginary line in front of my driveway, the sensors tripped. The night didn't just end, it vanished. Two twin beams of artificial sunlight erupted from my garage, slicing through the darkness with such intensity that the interior of Monica's SUV was instantly illuminated like a stage play. I watched on the monitor as she jerked her head back, shielding her eyes with her clipboard. The light was so bright I could see the startled expression on her face through her tinted windshield. She slammed on her brakes, her SUV rocking on its suspension. She sat there, blinded and pinned by 40,000 lumens of security. After a 30-second delay, the lights clicked off, plunging the street back into a darkness that felt twice as heavy as before. She tried to move forward again, perhaps thinking it was a fluke. Flash. The lights hammered her again. This time, she didn't wait. She threw the SUV into reverse, her tires chirping as she backed up the hill and disappeared around the corner. The next morning, I was back on the porch, staring at a fresh orange slip that had been taped to the street side of my mailbox. Technically public property, but Monica didn't care about technicalities anymore. It wasn't a fine. It was a formal grievance, claiming my lights were a hazard to public safety and visually assaultive. I pulled out the spite ledger and wrote, Entry 6, Monica, security lights, hazardous. "Everything okay?" Steve asked, walking over with a box of donuts. "Better than okay," I said, pointing to the garage. "She hates the light, Steve. And you know what they say about things that hide in the dark. They can't stand it when you turn the sun on." I looked at the stadium lights, then at my purple door, then at the yellow hose nest. My house was no longer a home. It was a lighthouse of defiance, and the signal was being received loud and clear. The ledger was becoming a thick testament to Monica's crumbling sanity. By the time the third week of the Beige War rolled around, she wasn't just patrolling, she was hunting. She had started wearing a tactical vest with multiple pockets for her pens and citation pads, prowling the sidewalks like a prison warden on the verge of a riot. On Wednesday, the Auditory Purity Initiative began. I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the rhythmic clack-clack of a woodpecker, when I saw Monica standing on the sidewalk in front of the Henderson house. The Hendersons were a quiet, elderly couple who mostly kept to themselves, but they had a small, delicate set of bamboo wind chimes hanging from their back porch, a gift from their daughter. I watched through my binoculars as Monica held up a decibel meter. She stood perfectly still for 3 minutes, waiting for a breeze. When a light gust finally rattled the bamboo, she smirked and scribbled. 10 minutes later, Steve was at my property line, looking like he'd seen a ghost. "She's finding the Hendersons, Mark," Steve said, his voice hushed with disbelief. "$40 for auditory disturbance. She's claiming the bamboo chimes exceed the neighborhood's ambient noise ceiling and constitute a persistent acoustic nuisance." Mrs. Henderson was crying. She told Monica it was the last thing her daughter gave her before moving overseas, and Monica just told her that sentimental value does not override civic silence. I felt the bourbon-like burn of righteous indignation settle in my gut. Finding a nurse for working late was bad. Painting over a kid's birdhouse was worse. But harassing an 80-year-old woman over the sound of hollow wood hitting wood, that was the final straw. Civic silence? I muttered, standing up and heading for the garage. If Monica wants to talk about acoustics, I think it's time we gave her a symphony she'll never forget. I spent the afternoon at a specialty outdoor store and a maritime surplus warehouse. I didn't buy bamboo. I bought metal. I purchased 12 sets of the most oversized, deep-toned, industrial-grade wind chimes ever forged. These weren't the tinkling kind. These were cathedral bell kind. Heavy, thick-walled aluminum tubes designed to be heard across open valleys. I didn't stop there. I bought a set of decorative brass gongs and several strings of hollow steel pipes. When I got home, I spent 4 hours mounting them to the eaves of my porch, the branches of my oak tree, and even a custom-built rack I bolted to the side of my garage, all perfectly within my property line. "Mark, what have you done?" Steve asked that evening. He was standing in his yard, staring up at the forest of metal hanging from my house. "I've updated the neighborhood's acoustic profile," I said, wiping grease from my hands. "I'm calling it the Sound of Liberty." The wind stayed still until about 10 p.m. I was sitting on my porch, waiting. Suddenly, a cold front pushed through, and the air began to move. The sound didn't just start, it erupted. The deep, resonant bong of the aluminum tubes echoed through the cul-de-sac like a funeral bell for the HOA. The steel pipes chimed in with a sharp, metallic ping, and the brass gongs added a shimmering, hypnotic vibration that you could feel in your teeth. It wasn't noise. It was a deep, harmonic resonance that filled the entire valley. It was beautiful, haunting, and incredibly loud. Within minutes, I saw Monica's bedroom light flick on. She came out of her house in a silk robe, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She marched down the middle of the street, her slippers slapping the pavement. She stopped at the edge of my lawn, the wind whipping her hair into a frenzy as the chimes roared above her. "Mark!" she screamed, though her voice was drowned out by a particularly heavy gust that sent the cathedral bells into a crescendo. "Cease immediately. You are in violation of the county noise ordinance." I leaned over the railing, cupping my ear. "What's that, Monica? I can't hear you over the sound of my decorative installations. Aren't they soothing?" She pulled out her decibel meter, her hand shaking so hard she almost dropped it. She held it up toward my porch. I watched her face fall as she realized the wind was natural. In our county, you could be fined for amplified music, but natural acoustic resonance from non-mechanical devices was a gray area, especially on non-HOA land. "It's harassment!" she shrieked. She stood there for 10 minutes, a beige figure silhouetted against the dark street, pinned by the overwhelming sound of a dozen metal bells. She looked small. She looked defeated. As she finally turned and stomped back to her house, I pulled out the spite ledger. I wrote, "Entry 7, Monica. Wind chimes. Acoustic nuisance. Note, chimes are performing beautifully. High harmonic resonance achieved." The wind didn't die down until dawn. Steve told me the next morning that for the first time in years, he didn't hear the sound of Monica's SUV patrolling at midnight. The chimes had acted like a sonic shield, keeping the peace by making the loudest, most glorious noise the estates had ever heard. The ledger had become a thick testament to Monica's crumbling sanity. By the time the third week of the Beige War rolled around, she wasn't just patrolling, she was hunting. She had started wearing a tactical vest with multiple pockets for her pens and citation pads, prowling the sidewalks like a prison warden on the verge of a riot. On Friday afternoon, the Spite Ledger received an entry that hit a new low. Mrs. Gable, the 84-year-old widow who lived behind Heather, was out on her sidewalk, crying. Monica was standing over her, pointing a manicured finger at a tiny, weathered ceramic turtle that had sat under a hosta leaf for 20 years. "Statuary of any kind," Monica was saying, her voice thin and sharp like a razor, "must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. This object is a whimsical distraction that undermines the somber, cohesive naturalism of our landscape. It's a $50 fine, Mrs. Gable, plus $10 for every day it remains on display." Mrs. Gable's hands were shaking as she picked up the 3-inch turtle. "It was my husband's," she whispered. "He bought it for our anniversary." "Sentimental value," Monica replied, clicking her pen with a sound like a bone snapping, "does not override the community's visual standards." I was watching through my binoculars from the porch, And for the first time in this war, I didn't just feel annoyed. I felt a cold, quiet rage. I walked across the yard, crossed the street, and approached Mrs. Gable. Monica glared at me, but I ignored her. "Mrs. Gable," I said gently, "may I borrow your turtle for a few days? I'd like to give him a job, a position of high command." The old woman looked confused, but handed me the small ceramic reptile. I tucked it into my pocket and tipped my hat at Monica. "He's leaving the estates now, Monica. He's seeking political asylum." I went straight to Steve's. "Get the truck. We're going on a recruitment drive." We spent the next 6 hours hitting every garden center, hardware store, and kitschy roadside gift shop within a 50-mile radius. I wasn't looking for tasteful fountains or stone benches. I was looking for the outcasts of the ceramic world. I was looking for gnomes. I returned at dusk with a bed full of cargo. The next morning, Monica's silver SUV rounded the corner for her Saturday morning sweep of the street. She slowed down as she approached my property, and her brakes squealed as she came to a dead stop. My front lawn was no longer a lawn. It was a porcelain battlefield. I had installed 47 garden gnomes in a massive military formation along my property line, all facing the HOA territory. In the front row, a dozen gnomes stood in a skirmish line. Behind them, a phalanx of 2-foot-tall gnomes held ceramic lanterns like bayonets. On the flanks, I had positioned gnomes riding ceramic squirrels. And in the very center, perched on top of a stone pedestal I'd built overnight, was the commander-in-chief. It was Mrs. Gable's tiny, 3-inch ceramic turtle. I had placed him on a velvet cushion glued to the pedestal. Surrounded by 47 armed gnomes, the little turtle looked like a god-king leading a holy war. Monica stepped out of her car, her face a pale, sickly shade of white. She walked to the edge of the asphalt, staring at the army. I was standing on my porch, leaning on a broom. "Mark," she gasped. What? What is this nightmare?" "This isn't a nightmare, Monica," I said. "This is a peacekeeping force. And that turtle? He's the general. My land is now an officially recognized sanctuary for persecuted statuary." "This is a mockery," she screamed. "It's a violation of the entire spirit of this community." "Actually," I said, pulling out a copy of the county zoning laws. "In this county, garden decorations on private property are protected as temporary personal expression. You can't touch the general, and you certainly can't touch his army." Monica looked at the general on his pedestal. She looked at Mrs. Gable's house, where the old woman was watching from the window with a look of pure joy. Monica didn't say another word. She got back into her SUV and sat there, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. I pulled out the spite ledger. Entry 8. Monica. The Great Gnome Deployment. The general has taken his post. Morale is at an all-time high. The gnome deployment had been the turning point. Monica no longer looked at my house with annoyance. She looked at it with a twitching, obsessive focus. It was obvious to everyone, including her, that I wasn't just decorating. I was a dark mirror. For every orange slip she handed out, a corresponding sin appeared on my side of the line, magnified and impossible to ignore. The neighborhood had started calling my property the Hall of Grudges. By Monday, the psychological toll was visible. Monica's silver SUV didn't just patrol anymore. It prowled. She would sit at the curb for 20 minutes at a time, her eyes darting from a neighbor's non-compliant flower bed to the exaggerated, chaotic version of that same violation on my lawn. I had created a feedback loop of petty bureaucracy, and it was driving her toward a ledge. The final straw came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting on my porch, updating the spite ledger, when I saw Monica corner a new young couple, the Millers, at the end of the street. They had committed the cardinal sin of unauthorized porch furniture, a pair of simple, dark green Adirondack chairs. The color palette for outdoor seating, Monica's voice drifted up the street, sharp and shrill, is restricted to natural cedar or charcoal gray. These are forest pine. That's a $50 fine per chair, per day. I watched as the young husband tried to argue, but Monica didn't listen. She was already writing the ticket, her pen moving with a frantic, shaky energy. She looked up and caught me watching. She didn't look away. She stared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. She knew what was coming. "Don't even think about it, Mark," she yelled toward my house. "You're mocking the very foundation of this community." "I'm just a fan of furniture, Monica," I shouted back. The next morning, I didn't just buy 2 chairs. I went to a local liquidator and bought 25 plastic Adirondack chairs in the most offensive neon clashing colors available: hot pink, electric lime, and safety orange. I didn't put them on the porch. I arranged them in a giant circular coliseum right in the middle of my front yard facing the street. In the center of the circle, I placed the general, Mrs. Gable's tiny turtle, on a high-backed, throne-like chair I'd fashioned from a milk crate. It was a perfect, grotesque reflection of her latest find. Every time she looked at the miller's 2 dark green chairs, she was forced to see my 25 neon monstrosities. I was holding up a funhouse mirror to her soul, and she couldn't stand the reflection. I was standing in the middle of my chair circle, adjusting the general's throne, when Monica's SUV came screaming down the street. She didn't stop at the curb. She jumped the mountable curb of the HOA pavement and came to a halt with her front tires inches from my property line. She stepped out of the car, and for the first time, I saw her without the clipboard. Her hair was disheveled, her beige tracksuit was wrinkled, and her eyes were bloodshot. She didn't look like a president. She looked like a cornered animal. "You're doing this on purpose," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Every time I fix something in this neighborhood, you break it on your side. You're mirroring me. You're trying to make my work look ridiculous." "I'm not making it look ridiculous, Monica," I said calmly, leaning against a hot pink chair. "I'm just showing you how ridiculous it already is. You find a lady for a turtle, I give the turtle an army. You find a nurse for her trash, I turn my bins into monuments. If you don't like the mirror, stop giving it something ugly to look at." She let out a low, guttural sound, a sob or a growl. I couldn't tell which. She looked at the general, sitting proudly on his milk crate throne. She looked at the neon chairs. Then she looked at the heavy sledgehammer sitting in the back of her SUV, which she'd been using to correct some illegal wooden stakes in a common area earlier that day. "I will purge this," she hissed, her hand drifting toward the back of her vehicle. "I will restore the visual order." I didn't move. I just tapped the lens of the high-definition security camera I'd mounted to my porch, the one currently streaming live to a cloud server. "Careful, Monica," I said softly. "You're about to cross a line you can't walk back from." She froze, her hand hovering over the latch of her SUV. She stood there for a long time, vibrating with a rage so intense it seemed to hum in the air. Finally, she got back into her car and sped off, her tires leaving black streaks on the pristine, muted sandstone pavement. Entry 9. Monica. The Neon Coliseum. Mirroring achieved 100% saturation. Subject is approaching critical failure. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like it might spontaneously combust. For 3 weeks, I had lived in the glow of neon purple and the resonance of cathedral bells, waiting for the final crack in Monica's armor. I didn't have to wait long. Tuesday night was silent, the kind of silence that usually precedes a disaster. I was asleep in the farmhouse when the notification on my phone vibrated against the nightstand. Motion detected. Front perimeter. I didn't turn on the lights. I rolled out of bed and grabbed my tablet, pulling up the live feed from the high-definition, security enhancement cameras I'd mounted after the stadium light skirmish. The screen flickered to life in night vision green, but the scene was illuminated by the soft, ambient glow of the streetlights. A figure was moving across my lawn. It was Monica. She wasn't wearing her aesthetic task force beige tracksuit anymore. She was in a dark, oversized hoodie and leggings. But there was no mistaking the gait, the rigid, frantic march of a woman on a mission from God. In her hands, she carried a heavy, long-handled sledgehammer. She looked like a shadow version of a Norse god, come to bring Ragnarok to my porcelain army. I watched, heart hammering against my ribs, as she reached the property line. She didn't hesitate. She stepped 6 inches, then 6 feet, onto my land. She was officially a trespasser. "Die," I heard her hiss through the tablet's microphone. It was a low, guttural sound that chilled my blood. She raised the sledgehammer over her head and brought it down with a sickening crunch. The general, Mrs. Gable's tiny ceramic turtle, was the first to go. The milk crate throne shattered, and the turtle was reduced to a fine gray dust. She didn't stop there. She moved with a manic, rhythmic energy, swinging the hammer into the ranks of my garden gnomes. Crack, smash, shatter. Porcelain heads rolled across my grass. Ceramic lanterns were crushed into the dirt. Visual, Harmony, she grunted with every swing. Smash. Architectural integrity. Crunch. She was sobbing and laughing at the same time, a sound of pure psychological collapse. After decimating the front line of gnomes, she turned her sights on the neon coliseum. She began to lay into the hot pink and electric lime Adirondack chairs, the heavy hammer splitting the plastic with loud, explosive pops that echoed through the silent cul-de-sac. Then she turned toward the house. She dropped the hammer and pulled a pressurized can of spray paint from her pocket. In the moonlight, I could see the label, Muted Sandstone. She marched up to my electric ultraviolet front door and began to spray. She wasn't just painting, she was attacking. She moved the can in jagged, violent strokes, trying to erase the purple defiance with her beige conformity. I checked the other window of my tablet. The local police dispatch had already acknowledged my silent alarm. 2 patrol cars were less than 3 blocks away, running without sirens to catch the vandal in the act. I stepped out onto the porch, the floorboards creaking. Monica didn't even flinch. She was too busy painting a giant, shaky X over my door knocker. Monica, I said softly. She spun around, the spray can still hissing. Her face was a mask of sweat, paint flecks, and tears. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown out, looking right through me. It's over, Mark, she panted, her voice trembling with a terrifying sort of triumph. I've corrected the record. I've restored the balance. It's all beige again. Monica, I said, pointing past her shoulder toward the street. Look. The silent blue and red lights of the patrol cars rounded the corner, casting a strobing, rhythmic glow over the ruins of my lawn. The officers didn't even have to exit their vehicles to see the crime. The stadium lights I'd installed suddenly tripped, bathing the entire scene. The smashed gnomes, the broken chairs, and the woman with the smoking spray can in 40,000 lumens of blinding white truth. She didn't run. She didn't even drop the can. She just stood there in the spotlight, a beige vandal in a neon world, as the handcuffs clicked into place. I pulled out the spite ledger one last time that night. My hands were shaking, but my script was steady. Entry 10. Monica. The final snap. Subject apprehended mid-vandalism. The general has fallen, but the war is won. The morning after the midnight sledgehammer incident, the neighborhood didn't wake up to the sound of leaf blowers or Monica's SUV prowling the asphalt. It woke up to a heavy, stunned silence. By 8 a.m., the ruins of my front lawn had become a local landmark. Neighbors who usually kept their heads down and their garage doors shut were standing on the sidewalk, staring in disbelief at the shattered porcelain gnomes and the muted sandstone scars on my neon purple door. I spent the morning with a crime scene investigator pointing out the specific casualties of Monica's breakdown. Steve stood beside me, his jaw set in a hard line. He looked at the spot where the general, Mrs. Gable's tiny turtle, had been pulverized into dust. She's out on bail, Steve whispered, leaning against my porch railing. Her lawyer is already trying to claim temporary insanity brought on by a neighborhood nuisance. He's actually trying to blame you, Mark. He says your aggressive aesthetics triggered a psychological crisis. Let him try, I said, holding up a thumb drive containing the high-definition footage of Monica laughing as she swung the hammer. The law doesn't have a beige defense. She crossed the line, she destroyed private property, and she did it with a sledgehammer. That's a third-degree felony in this state. But I knew the legal system would take months. The HOA, however, moved at the speed of gossip. By noon, I had drafted the most important document in the history of the Crest Estates. It wasn't a citation or a fine. It was a formal petition for the immediate removal of the board president. I grabbed a clipboard, the same kind Monica used to wield like a weapon, and walked across the property line. Steve followed me, and then Heather. We started at Mrs. Gable's house. When the old woman saw the empty space where her husband's turtle had once sat, she didn't cry this time. She took my pen with a steady hand and signed her name in large, defiant letters. For the general, she whispered. We moved from house to house. I didn't have to explain much. Everyone had seen the police lights. Everyone had heard the sound of Liberty chimes. And everyone was tired of living in fear of a tape measure. She fined me for my kids' chalk art last month, one mother said, signing the paper so hard the pen nearly tore through. She told me my dog's bark was non-compliant with the acoustic guidelines. a man from 2 streets over adding his signature. By 4 p.m., I had the signatures of 42 out of the 50 households. It wasn't just a majority, it was a mandate. We marched to the community center for the emergency board meeting that had been called by the vice president, a man named Bill, who had spent the last 3 years hiding in Monica's shadow. The room was packed. Monica sat in the front row, her lawyer flanking her. She was wearing a gray suit, her hair pulled back into a tight, severe bun, trying to regain the image of the disciplined leader. But when she turned to look at the crowd, her eyes landed on me. I was wearing a t-shirt I'd made that afternoon. It featured a picture of a garden gnome and the words, "I stand with the general." Bill cleared his throat, looking at the restless crowd. "The board has received a formal complaint regarding recent events. Monica, do you have a statement regarding the pending criminal charges?" Her lawyer stood up. "My client is a victim of targeted harassment by a non-resident who—" Steve stood up, cutting him off. He didn't yell. He just walked to the front and slammed my clipboard onto the podium. "We don't care about your client's feelings. We care about the 4 pages of signatures here. These are the people who pay the dues. These are the people whose property Monica vandalized. According to Article 9, Section 2 of the bylaws, a board member can be removed by a majority vote for conduct unbecoming of the association. This isn't a vote," Monica shrieked, her mask finally slipping. "This is a mob. You need order. You need standards. Without me, this neighborhood will turn into that." She pointed a shaking finger toward the back of the room. "Toward me." "Actually," Heather stood up, her voice clear and resonant. "We like that. It has a lot more heart than this." The board members looked at each other. They looked at the signatures. They looked at the woman who had brought a sledgehammer to a birdhouse fight. Bill didn't even need to call for a secret ballot. He just looked at Monica and sighed. "Monica Vance," he said, his voice echoing in the silent hall. By the power-up, I sat in the back, crossed my arms, and watched as Monica, the woman who lived for rules, was finally undone by the very laws she had spent a decade weaponizing. The dust from the Great Beige War finally settled on a Saturday afternoon that felt fundamentally different from any that had come before it. The air didn't carry the usual tension of a neighborhood under siege. There was no silver SUV idling at the curb, no glint of a clipboard catching the sun, and no frantic scratching of pens against orange carbon paper. For the first time in nearly a decade, the residents of Crest Estates were actually standing on their front lawns, talking to one another without checking their watches or glancing over their shoulders to see if their conversation looked too much like an unauthorized gathering. I was out on my porch, finally tackling the task I'd been putting off since the night of the arrest, the restoration of my front door. I had spent the morning carefully scraping away the muted sandstone scars Monica had left behind in her final, desperate act of vandalism. I could have gone back to a safe, respectable white, but that felt like a retreat. Instead, I was applying a fresh, defiant coat of electric ultraviolet. It felt like keeping a promise to the street. Steve walked across the property line, carrying a wooden box wrapped in a tattered old tarp. He looked lighter, literally lighter, as if the crushing weight of the HOA handbook had been lifted off his chest. He set the box down on my porch table with a heavy thud and pulled back the fabric. Inside was a new birdhouse. It was red, a deep, brilliant crimson, and it was built like a fortress. It had a shingled roof made of slate, a little copper chimney, and the words, "The General's Quarters," burned into the wood above the entrance hole. "Leo and I spent the morning in the garage," Steve said, a genuine, toothy smile on his face. He wanted to make sure it was strong enough to withstand a sledgehammer. "We reinforced the frame with steel brackets, just in case history tries to repeat itself." "It's perfect, Steve," I said, wiping a smudge of purple paint onto my jeans. "Where are we deploying the command center?" "Right back where it belongs," he said, nodding toward the post. 6 inches onto the free side. We're keeping the Hall of Grudges as a permanent installation. The neighbors voted on it informally this morning over coffee. They said your lawn is the neighborhood's Statue of Liberty. As we bolted the new birdhouse into place, we watched a car pull out of a driveway 3 doors down. It was Monica. She had put her house on the market 48 hours after the board meeting. Realizing that a woman who had tried to correct her neighbors with a sledgehammer didn't have much of a social future in Oak Crest. Her SUV was packed to the roof with boxes of files and, I assumed, enough beige paint to coat a small moon. She didn't look at us as she drove away. She didn't look at the for sale sign that someone, I suspect Gary, had decorated with a tiny ceramic turtle at the base. She just stared straight ahead. A woman who had tried to build a kingdom out of conformity and ended up with nothing but a court date and a ruined reputation. The Spite Ledger was still sitting on my porch table, its pages a chaotic chronicle of our victory. I picked up my pen and flipped to the very last page to write the final entry. Entry 12. The New Guard. Board dissolved and replaced by Steve and Heather. Fines suspended indefinitely. The general's successor is in place, and the purple door is back to full power. Peace has returned to the valley, and it's anything but quiet. The wind picked up then, and the sound of Liberty chimes let out a deep, resonant bong that echoed through the valley. It wasn't a noise complaint anymore. It was a heartbeat. A few doors down, Heather pulled her trash cans to the curb at 2 p.m., 4 hours early by the old rules, and left them there with a defiant flourish. She saw us and waved a cheerful middle finger toward the disappearing silver speck of Monica's SUV. Steve and I cracked open 2 cold beers and sat in our mismatched, neon-colored lawn chairs. My yard was still a beautiful mess of neon plastic, yellow hoses, and the remaining porcelain soldiers of the Gnome Army. But to the people on this street, it was a masterpiece. It was a reminder that a property line is just a mark on a map, but a community is something you build with your own hands. And sometimes you have to defend it with a purple door and a lot of spite. So, Steve asked, looking at the half-full can of electric ultraviolet, what are we doing with the rest of that? I looked at his boring, black, HOA-compliant mailbox and then back at the purple door. I think the mailbox could use some chromatic energy, don't you? It's time the mail arrived in style. Steve laughed, a sound that wasn't interrupted by a single orange slip. The war was over, the general was home, and for the first time in 15 years, the neighborhood was finally gloriously colorful.